Welcome to this week's episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I am your host, Olga Peters, and this is the show where we talk about how everything in Montpelier shakes out for the rest of us. I am joined this week by regular contributor Emily Kornheiser, who's one of three reps from the town of Brattleboro, and welcome back to the show, John. Always glad to see you. John Walters, he is a political reporter and the force behind the Vermont Political Observer blog. And we were just commenting before the show, John, that you have just been, with this political season, man, you've been churning out the blog posts left, right, and center.
Well, it's been a busy year, and there's so much to write about. There's still stuff that I would like to write about the primary, even though it's almost a month in the rear view. So, there's a lot of stuff going on.
Well, I hope in the second half we'll get to some of the political chit chat or maybe a little gossip, because we do like to do that from time to time. But before we do that, we're going to talk about, there's some big news dropped about what's happening with the Vermont emergency housing funding. Two programs in particular, the Vermont Emergency Rental Assistance, which a lot of people call VRAP, and then also the Transitional Housing program. Those are two that I've seen come across the news wire. And then there's something else, Emily, I can tell.
So it's all one pot of money that everyone sort of calls the VRAP money, which is the Vermont Emergency Rental Assistance Program. And it's all this pot of federal money, mostly through FEMA, that covers the Vermont Emergency Rental Assistance Program, that sends money directly from the Vermont State Housing Authority to folks who have a low enough income and need assistance paying their rent through the pandemic. But there's also the GA housing, which it's been paying for, which is the motel housing. And originally the motel housing was paid for in a different way, but it's been paid through this program since the spring. And then all of the utility assistance money that's been going out for the last however many months, years, also goes through this fund. And then there's a fourth category, which is rental assistance directly to folks on Reach Up. That's been going out from this fund. And then I think there might be a fifth category, though I'm not sure what it is. And the reason that naming all of those different pots of money is important, we will get into, because it is perhaps part of the massive administrative failure that led to this point.
Right, which, thank you for that rundown. I was actually kind of hoping to talk about what's going to happen to the money first before we dove into which different pots.
Let's do it.
But so John, tell us, why is this a concern right now? What's happening with what decision has the administration made?
Well, I think it was roughly a little over a week ago, the administration held a press conference in which they announced that VRAP was almost out of money, that they were going to have to start cutting off people at the end of September, which is extremely sudden, especially in the very, very tight rental market we have, across Vermont. To suddenly cut off people's assistance that quickly, and thousands more would be cut off at the end of November, and then the fund would dwindle down and maybe make it through the winter for the rest of the people. And this would also involve apparently cutting off utility assistance, just as the snow is starting to fly. And the reason, the potential scandal behind this is that the administration announced this with very little warning, with no warning, and they claimed that they said that they didn't realize it until just now, which is either astounding managerial incompetence or they are lying. And I don't know which is worse, and I don't know which it is. Did they not know about it until just now? They should have. Did they know about it before now and hold off on telling people until there was no choice but to take drastic action? Did they know about it supposedly this is a result of the U.S. Treasury changing the rules on the federal money, which happened in the spring. If they realized it in the spring and they didn't tell the legislature, then that's a really big deal. The most charitable interpretation is that they royally screwed up.
Mm-hmm. And we should just, if I understand what you're implying, John, about the springtime, is, spring is kind of March to May, but the legislature might have still been in session when they found out, and so they could have taken action. Is that kind of what you're implying?
Yeah.
Okay. Just checking.
That's the evil interpretation of what they did. Like I said, the positive interpretation is that they just it was just a complete management, what the British call a cock up.
Mm-hmm.
And, a year and a half ago, there was a massive administrative failure with the Department of Labor in the spring that was not shared with the legislature until August.
Right.
That also had a pretty significant impact on people's lives, and the legislature was not in a position to do anything about because we found out about it too late. So there are some themes that I think we'll unpack a little bit here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, one thing that jumped out to me when I was reading John's latest post on your blog is just, Vermont trumpeted at the beginning of COVID how well it responded to keeping people housed. Mm-hmm. Through the rental assistance, through the general assistance / hotel program, through all these different really quick measures that people just kind of buckled down and problems that they solved. Mm-hmm. So is it fair to say that it sounds like this this turn of events has it unraveled all of that good work?
Well, I think what's extraordinary about it is that first round, we did it so well with totally open dollars and chose to spend money that we could have spent anyway on that particular population, that particular challenge, so that the next round of federal money had to be spent that way across the country. So we did this thing very well. Then everyone else in the country was required to do it. There were more restrictions put on it, which did alter the way we were the existing programs we had created were going to be administered. Of course, more complicated, because that's what happens when federal regs get involved, which is, government accountability is important. Here's an example of where government accountability didn't work. And I think one thing that I've been talking about with colleagues about this is, so that first round, and we talked about this so much on the show already, that first round was about public health. And I think there were a lot of people who felt like, I need to make sure that those people are kept in sort of safe, semi-isolated conditions and cared for so that me and my people are safe. And I think that was a lot of the comfort around that first real emergency move. That's the uncharitable interpretation of it. But I think it allowed the combination of that and housing is a human right, this is a public health emergency thinking. It helped all of those perspectives to come together and to have broad agreement that that's what we needed to do. There is now a majority of folks across the country, maybe across the globe, who think that the public health emergency has passed. And so all things must wind down. What I think is striking about this is there were many of us in the legislature, outside of the legislature, who thought, and we've talked about this so much on the show, housing's a human right. Housing's better for the economy. It's better for humans. It's better for everything. People need to stay housed. We figure out how to do that during the pandemic. Let's not let it go. Mm-hmm. And while the public health emergency might have passed in some ways, the housing crisis is actually worse than it was back then because of the knock-on economic effects of us becoming the public health refuge for the, rich and famous. And we now have much more of a housing crisis than we did before. And even if even if people had resources who were in the motels, they have nowhere to go. And I don't there's article after article about it, but I still feel like people don't really feel in their bones how few options there are for people for housing right now. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. What do you think, John?
I believe, if I recall correctly, the current rental vacancy rate in Vermont as a total is 2 to 2.5%.
That sounds about right.
A healthy vacancy rate is more like 4 to 5%. That's where the market forces balance out between landlords and renters. So it's way out of whack. And in Chittenden County, the vacancy rate is 0.4%.
And that's true in Windham County too.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing. There's nowhere for people to go. There's nowhere for people in emergency housing or motels to go, even if they have the money to pay for it. The other thing I mentioned here about our housing crisis is there was just an article on the VT Digger a few days ago about how more and more of our housing is being bought by investors.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes, often, not occupied.
Mm-hmm.
This is more of a problem with high-end housing in places like Stowe and Killington, but it has its effect on the market as a whole, and it makes building expensive housing more attractive to builders. So it's part of the big crunch that that has made this sort of what was supposed to be a nice smooth glide path out of the pandemic, assuming you think we're out of the pandemic, and to a sustainable housing system that has been short-circuited, partly because of market forces, partly because of unforeseen knock-on effects of the pandemic. But it's a mess. I mean, we have the emergency rental assistance program winding down, and there's no real clear idea, at least in my head, of how we're going to deal with, by the end of November, 8,400 households having their rental assistance gone.
Mm-hmm. And I don't know if either of you have a handle on this, but one question I had when I was just reading some of these articles is, okay, if we're taking the argument that the pandemic has passed and things need to wind down, if we're just taking that argument, then have either of you heard why people still need this assistance? I mean, I'm curious, did people go into the pandemic and through the course of the pandemic, rents have gone up like crazy? So now they need more assistance. Is it that people are still having a hard time finding work? What problems, were there problems going into the pandemic? How much of this is not, is there a context there?
So there is not as much data as might be desired in an ideal universe of understanding the problem. And certainly Vermont struggles with that one on a good day. I also want to be clear, this is not inevitable that this will happen. This is just what the administration announced. And we spend too much time having the administration announce something and we all assume it's inevitable. So I want to be very clear about that one. It's not inevitable. It's just been announced. And the rules haven't even been finalized yet. So, but there are a lot of folks in the motels specifically who were having housing struggles before the pandemic, would have been in the overflow shelter around the state. In the winter, would have been camping during the summer, couch surfing. Some people think there's sort of a distinction between the couch surfing population stability and the not able to couch surf population stability, and how those folks should be eligible or not eligible. That was part of the original GA housing rules. And so a lot of those folks are sort of the standard churn of the failing capitalist post whatever universe we live in. There are certainly a lot of folks who are still struggling mightily financially because childcare is really still very, very, very hard for many families. And wages have not, we know that rents have skyrocketed. And a lot of people are being sort of evicted. If they do find a new place, it's much more expensive than the last place. And people are being evicted because houses are being sold in order for second homeowners or, pandemic refugees. So there's that population. One thing that's interesting about, can I get into the money part yet, Olga, or should I keep? Okay. So they're split between let's leave the utilities aside for now, but there's the money that goes directly to Reach Up participants that is happening automatically. So there isn't a question for Reach Up participants, are you struggling to pay rent? Here is your rental subsidy. It is going automatically to Reach Up participants to cover the rent. Now, we've talked before on the show and had an entire episode dedicated to Reach Up where it's very there's no universe where the $400 a month that goes to Reach Up is enough money for people. And so this was a way to sort of make Reach Up a more living possibility for folks. But again, it's not linked to people's ability or inability to pay their rent based on their living situation. Similarly, the VRAP that that's actually the program that's actually called VRAP that goes out of the Vermont State Housing Authority. When that first started, the eligibility was linked much more closely to people's ability to pay, much more closely related to people having back rent bills. But in the spring, when there was concern that we actually weren't spending the money fast enough for the feds, there was a much bigger push on that program to get money out the door. And so, yeah.
Sorry, is that there's also mortgage assistance too? Yeah. Is that wrapped in there too?
Mortgage assistance, lot assistance, lot rent, and rent. And so there's a bigger push to get that money out the door. It's possible and sort of hypothesized that maybe some of the folks with that money are financially eligible, but not sort of might not have an emergency need. But again, don't have data on that. But that's it seems like it's possible that was sort of the rapidly growing alligator mouth that ate up the other funds because there was a big push for that. The motel assistance has grown a little bit, but not in sort of an alligator mouth way from what we can tell so far, that we have not gotten final numbers from the administration. And then the utility assistance was very, very slow to get the word out. As you said, winter's coming for the utilities. The one thing that's sort of reassuring to me about that is that we actually have regulatory mechanisms in place that people's electricity and heat can't be shut off during the winter. So that at least we actually have laws connected and regulations connected to that one, unlike the fact that people can still be evicted in the middle of the winter in Vermont with no recourse. So that's the different pieces of money and how they fit together and how the dollars might have gotten spent quickly.
If I may ask Emily a question, you mentioned earlier that you and your colleagues are talking about this. Obviously, I would expect that, but what are you saying? What's going to come from the legislature, or do you know yet?
The speaker and the pro tem put out a statement immediately that was, the very polite sort of Dem need to collaborate with the administration version of what the F happened here and why did you not talk to us, right? But it was very polite. And definitely there's some people who are why must we always be so polite? We have limited options before January, as you know. And even if we have a plan going into January, nothing, in a best case scenario, money wouldn't get out the door until mid-February. The only real mechanism we have available before January is the Joint Fiscal Committee, which I sit on, and does not actually have any real decision-making power. It really just has sort of the power of hearings and persuasion, and can approve things that the administration proposes, but can't do formal budget adjustment. So it depends on how far the money is moving, depends on how much we could do. I am positive, though I have not seen the numbers, that there are other funds that have not been spent fast enough in other places of the administration, because that's what every past report I've gotten has said. And so it's possible that there's other money that could be moved around, that the rules could be shifted, that things could be postponed between now and then. But again, that requires collaboration with the administration to get done, and creates this really interesting balancing act that you are incredibly eloquent about, John, which is basically like, what is our role as legislators to hold the administration accountable for like what often can seem like gross negligence, and be in this position in a tiny state where most policy is made through what feels like personal relationships to actually get it done. Because as a citizen legislature, it's very, very hard to craft good policy without the corresponding administrative branch or department collaborating. And so how would real accountability possibly keep us from developing good policy in the future? And I think the Department of Labor is a great case study of that from last year.
Yeah,
John,
there's a whole thing that I'm going to write someday about the almost complete lack of oversight in the state. The working title is "We Have No Idea How Well Our Government Works." And, you know, it's like the auditor does a little bit of stuff, the legislature's joint fiscal office does some good stuff, but the citizen legislature is really in no position structurally to carry out the kind of oversight that, say, the US Congress does. So, you know, the administration, whichever administration it is, basically doesn't really have any effective outside oversight 90% of the time or more than that. So, but that's a topic for another day.
well, actually, it made me wonder, John, if someone was to put in a public records request, which is a form of oversight,
yeah,
what are some of your outstanding questions? Like, what kind of information or questions would you be looking for?
Well, the thing that I would be focusing on is, you know, when the administration knew about this. You know, did they have no idea until last week? You know, end of August. Did they know earlier, and when did they know, and how much did they know when? And so, you know, the way to get at that would be to do a public records request for any communications within the administration, written, digital, whatever, having to do with VRAP and its budgeting. And that would clarify a lot. It would be a fair bit of work to slog through all those emails. You know, and it would be nice if one of our remaining media organizations with any muscle left on the bone, like maybe VT Digger, would take this on. Because I think there is a story to tell about how this happened. And all we have now is a very sketchy version of the administration's version of how this happened.
I don't want to be a negative Nelly here with my two reporter friends, but okay, let's say someone slogs through all those public records requests. It turns out that the administration knew in March, and this was actually a deliberate ploy to end this program without anyone doing anything about it. Then what?
Well,
I mean, that's what happened with the Department of Labor last year. Like, it was very clear to the entire legislature that they had purposely kept a secret from us in order to not implement a law that we put into effect, and yet nothing happened. And
that is because
the person who was commissioner, was an interim commissioner at the point, was actually promoted to being a permanent commissioner in the midst of that.
Emily, the only answer I have for you, and this is a frustration I have as a journalist, is a journalist's job is to witness,
yes,
and to tell the truth, but it's the community's job to then take that truth and act on it. So the question I would put to the legislature is who's acting on anything? And I would put the question to the voters too, like, how are you going to act on this new information? Because, you know, a journalist can write about something till they're blue in the face, but until the community does something.
Yeah, you get the constant complaints about the media that they aren't covering a certain thing enough. And the truth is that you kind of can't cover something enough to penetrate the public consciousness unless there's some sort of, you know, zeitgeist momentum build. You can put out a great story on, like, Digger has done a lot over the years on EB5, and I think that has finally stuck, at least to the extent that, people generally know that EB5 was supposed to be a good thing and it turned out to be a fiscal disaster. But that takes a lot, and a lot of it is out of the media's hands. So, a lot of the time when I hear someone say the media hasn't covered this, I can point to some examples of when the media has covered it, but, the media can only do so much. And yes, after that, it has to pick up steam from legislators, responsible officials, members of the public putting pressure on. And that's one of the things that's kind of frustrating ongoingly about Phil Scott, is that he seems to have a Teflon coating and none of this ever sticks to him. And, there are clear signs that his administration at least sometimes falls down on the job, and there's not enough quality control. But so far, he hasn't paid the price.
So we have to go to break in a minute, but since we did open this can of worms, if, as Emily said, if this was a ploy to wind down this program, is there anyone whose specific job would be to hold the governor's feet to the fire? Like, is there a chain of command? Is it just at the voting booth? Like,
I mean, every minute that a citizen legislature spends in that kind of government accountability is a minute that we can't spend actually trying to solve the problem that the administration created. So an example that I think is a very neat parallel is this Department of Labor issue, where they purposely and basically publicly did not implement a law and kept it a secret until we couldn't do anything about it because of sort of a federal rule thing. We had a working group already set up in statute that fall that was supposed to do some massive fixes to the unemployment insurance system. We only had 3 meetings that we were sort of appropriated and allowed to do. You can't actually change the number of meetings that you're allowed to make without an act of the legislature. So we had these 3 official meetings. And those 3 official meetings, a huge amount of them was turned over to trying to hold the Department of Labor accountable for this administrative failure. And because of that, we didn't actually take the amount of time that we needed to solve some massive problems. And part of the result of that was that the legislature still did not do very much about unemployment insurance this last session that we should have done. And so in the limited time that we have this fall to maybe be figuring out a plan for the January to do something about housing, are we going to spend that having public hearings where we yell at the Department of, the Agency of Administration and, the chair of Finance and Management about this issue and get down and dirty into why these 6 different programs weren't feeding into the right spreadsheet line and no one was looking at that spreadsheet line? Or do we try to do something about housing? And there's no one specific to do that. I have grand ideas I can talk about after the break for something that New Mexico does, but nothing right now. And it's really frustrating.
Well, on that note, go ahead, John.
That sort of chicken and the egg problem there is the result of the administration not announcing this until the last minute.
Mm-hmm.
So if the evil interpretation holds, then their withholding of information actually helps them by preventing any effective review of what they did. Because, as Emily said, the legislature's first job is to fix the problem that's been set before them.
That said, I very rarely, there's so much incompetence in the universe and people are struggling so hard right now. Very rarely is the conspiracy true. Most of the time, people are just failing. And that's such as life.
We will be back in a moment. The Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. Don't touch that dial.
Okay.
Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. You can also find us on Brattleboro Community Television or BCTV, Emily's YouTube channel, our Facebook page, our webpage, and wherever you find podcasts. I am joined this week by regular contributor Emily Kornheiser, one of three reps from Brattleboro, as well as journalist John Walters. And we have been talking about in the kind of microscopic, we've been talking about rental assistance and an announcement from the administration about how that rental assistance and how I should just say housing assistance may be going away for some people. However, as we've talked, it's kind of opened the bigger picture of government accountability and what can people actually do to hold their government accountable. And Emily, during the break, you used a great phrase. You said, what are people's outrage worth? So before you answer that question, Emily, what do we need to remind listeners of?
Well, the views and opinions expressed here on the Montpelier Happy Hour are those of the host and the guests, and not the station, nor their employers, nor even their party.
Thank you. So, John, can you answer Emily's question? What are, when people learn what their government's been up to and they are outraged, what next?
The simple answer probably comes straight out of the Schoolhouse Rock. And it's obvious, and we can repeat it until we're blue in the face, and most people don't do it, but it's getting involved. And that doesn't necessarily mean getting involved in legislative hearings, although it would be nice if more citizens showed up for legislative hearings and gave their input instead of hearing from the same officials over and over again. But getting involved locally, working in your city party or county party, whichever party you're in, doing some volunteer work for a candidate or for a lawmaker. In the absence of lawmakers having staff, maybe they could, get some interested people in the community to do a little stuff for them.
That would be amazing, universe. I just want to say thank you, John. Campaign season volunteers are great, but legislative season volunteers would be magical.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because the work really is overwhelming for legislators, and I can say that because I'm not one. And I have seen it at work, and I have seen the limited amount of time that the legislature has. And Emily was right when she said in the first half of the show that they have to make some really serious choices about what they do. And if they devote, if they had set up something like the January 6th Commission and had, months of interviews and, public hearings that are carefully orchestrated and all that, then that committee, those people wouldn't get anything else done that year.
Mm-hmm.
And you just can't leave policy making alone that long. As it is, the legislature barely gets to, probably a third of the things that they could get to and that they really ought to get to. And it's not their fault. It's that everything takes time and they have very little of it. If there were some way to get involved with your lawmaker, to provide some help, whatever that might be, that could be a really valuable, at least a little bit of an addition to what the legislature can do and what we can do in the policy space.
And
it's amazing how much people think that the government is this thing that's far away, and in the federal universe it is, but legislators are really, really highly accessible in Vermont, and they can be contacted, and they take public contact seriously, and they take the views that they get seriously. So you can have an effect in a state like Vermont.
Sorry, Emily, I just want to be really clear in case there are listeners sitting out there wondering this. there's no one else in government like the Secretary of State, thinking other elected officials, or the auditor, or any other office whose job it is to kind of look at the legislature or the administration and hold them accountable.
Well,
Like that's
that's kind of what the auditor is supposed to do. So can we
okay.
get into that in 1 second? I just want to put a fine point on what John said. If I get an email from a constituent about an issue, that's a big deal. If I get 3, I start to think, oh my God, what's going on here? The most I've ever gotten on a single issue, and I'm talking about like abortion and guns, and was on school lunches. And even then it was like 30. And I felt like there was like a waterfall or a hose or whatever water thing we would use to describe it. So it's like really, and that's true for other legislators too. It's not just, me in my district. So it does matter.
Thank you.
So there's other sort of mechanisms to hold accountable. I think it's also, right before the break, I said that incompetence is generally more likely than conspiracies. And I want to be clear that there are a lot of reasons why the particular shape of the administration right now could fail. And it's not because they're bad people. We've been chronically underfunding state government for decades under multiple administrations and multiple parties, so that the people who are left have more to do and often less training to do it and less systems in place to do it well than at any other point in history, really. In the history of like the grand bureaucratic experiment, that started in the 1800s. So I don't want to blame any single individual for that. Though I think the point of having politically appointed secretaries and commissioners is in order to blame a single individual. And the Scott administration is famously skilled at not blaming those secretaries and commissioners. In fact, they tend to get promoted. So I just want to be sort of like clear. I don't, someone not looking at a spreadsheet might be because like we're all under like the worst chronic stress of our entire lives right now. And like everyone's doing a bad job at everything, myself included.
Well, and I didn't ask the question assuming that there had been wrongdoing, but it sounds like, just based on what I'm hearing from you and John right now, is that we may not even have mechanisms in place to adequately address when we need to change course, when mistakes have happened and people are going to feel those ramifications, i.e. rental assistance drying up. What do we, like, even just to be able to say, okay, here's where the mistake happened and here's how we will correct it so it doesn't happen in the future. I mean, it's kind of sounding like we don't even really have an adequate structure for that.
No, it largely depends on the administration caring about the job they're doing, and holding their own officials accountable for when things go wrong. And governors are not big on that. Peter Shumlin was, if anything, even worse than Phil Scott about that. Nobody wants to come out in public and say their administration is failing. So,
fair enough.
but if you were a manager of a business and you had someone who wasn't doing the job, you would do something about it. And in state government, more often than not, as Emily said, they get promoted. In the middle of one of the Department of Labor screw ups, Michael Harrington was made acting commissioner and then made permanent commissioner, even though under his watch, the Labor Department was a disaster.
So where do we go from here then?
So the auditor does do some of this. The auditor's office is tiny, and tends to work in much longer term projects. And often by the time their report comes out, it gets a little sort of buried in the news feed, as we say. And then there's also the problem of, so I've I read all of the auditor's reports. Government accountability is incredibly important to me. It's like pretty much it's why I ran for office, as like unsexy as that is. And I still don't, so I read the report, the thing is uncovered. The mechanism to do something about that and make a public fuss is again, not there. Because the basic functions of our committee structures don't have a place for evaluating existing programs. We pretty much just look to create new ones. And part of that is our lack of staff, part of that is the part-time legislature, part of that is the citizen legislature, all these things. But New Mexico, which has a more part-time legislature than we do, they really only, every other year they only meet for a month. And the year that they're meeting for longer, it's still only, I think, 3 months. But they have a division in their joint fiscal office that's basically like a GAO, or Government Accountability Office, that works year-round on hearings, on accountability hearings about whether or not different departments are sort of meeting their goals, fulfilling their promise, and whether or not programs and sort of theories of change are effective. And it's very possible that we could do something like that here with a minimum of, I mean, we would need more staff, but we wouldn't need that many more staff. And that's something that's been talked about since before I was in the legislature, but always sort of on the sidelines. I was involved in a project on it before I joined the legislature. There's a committee in the legislature called the Government Accountability Committee that no one pays any attention to and tends to not do all that much. That is sort of a mechanism for it. But our joint committee structures, again, are like understaffed, under-resourced, not enough time, et cetera. So that's the bummer report on what's it called? Did I miss any? What did I miss, John?
Well, I would mention one more thing that's one of my hobby horses, which has nothing to do with government, really. It has to do with Vermont's tendency as a whole, culturally, socially, to ignore problems. Shortly after my partner and I moved into Vermont, we both became aware of something that we came to call the Vermont stare, which is basically that when you suggest a change in something, and it might be something as simple as like, you know, storing paper clips, or it might be something as complex as, you know, fixing our money problem. What you get back is not a, huh, that's interesting, or a, no, I don't think so. They just stare at you. And it's like it just goes past their heads and into the ether. And this is something, you know, we lived most of our lives in Michigan. We lived for a few years in New Hampshire before we moved here. And it's different here. And that plays into this. You know, my partner saw it in a big organization that he worked for. I saw it in a very small organization that I worked for. And it was, you know, the same sort of thing. And one time I was interviewing for a place I worked for then. I was interviewing the retiring president of National Life, which is the biggest private employer in central Vermont. And, you know, he was talking about like how to remain competitive in a global market when you're out here in Montpelier. And, you know, he was talking about stuff that rung with me enough that after we concluded the formal interview, I mentioned the Vermont stare, and he like said, yes, that's it. That's what I thought you were saying. So, you know, part of the fault is in our stars and part of the fault is in ourselves, I guess is what I'm saying. That's something we can't do anything about. The New Mexico idea sounds awfully intriguing, and it would be maybe, you know, if you get a citizen volunteer working with you, Emily, you can, you know, they can help develop that idea.
Or if a lot of citizens are listening right now and they want to band together and push the idea, that would be pretty cool too.
I also have a staff person at Joint Fiscal who's working on the idea, which is one of the, for my other legislator colleagues who are listening, I'm sorry, but about what I'm about to say, but it's really like, it's been a really, to see the difference in what's available to me resource wise now that I'm in leadership on a money committee is, I mean, it's night and day. So when I do have an idea, I don't have all the resources I need to develop it, but I at least have thought partnership in another person who is, you know, working full time and paid to think about it.
Oh, interesting.
Just
Interesting.
extraordinary. And that's a very, like, you know, that's like 15 people in the building.
Well, thank you, Emily and John. I want to, for the rest of the show, just kind of shift gears a little bit, because I don't think we can have John Walters on the show without getting a little politically gossipy, just a little bit. So I'm just going to turn it right to John and say, on the big political landscape, what have you been digging into lately?
Well, I just spent a lot of time looking at campaign finance reports and seeing, you know, where the major statewide candidates raised and spent their money, and trying to figure out sort of how the winners won and how the losers lost. And one thing that I haven't yet quite tackled, that's been suggested to me, is that actually Southern Vermont, and particularly Windham County, may have played a very big role in the primaries this year, because Becca Balint basically supercharged turnout.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, that helped her win. She also did extremely well in Chittenden County, which is where a lot of the votes are. But it's been suggested to me, for instance, that didn't elect Becca Balint, that didn't get her the nomination, but it may have pushed Sarah Copeland Hansis over the line to get the Secretary of State nomination. Because apparently she has some ties to Windham County too. So she may have had some voters to activate there, and that they were already activated because of Becca Balint. So I have to look at the turnout numbers this year compared to the turnout numbers in past primaries to see if that's really true, but I wouldn't be surprised.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's really, I've not heard that theory yet, and I love it, self-centered as I am.
It would be about time for Southern Vermont to make a difference, you know.
I mean, like, we have a lot of pretty awesome power down here and some great voters.
Yeah.
And I think we're often taken for granted because we're so reliable in our voting. And, you know, Sarah spent a decent, you know, I hosted these really regular forums to meet statewide candidates, and Sarah spent some time down here, and Charity spent some time down here, and did sort of, you know, take our weird little corner of the world for granted. And actually a decent number of other statewide candidates spent a lot of time down here. Sarah's brother lives in Brattleboro.
Okay.
They're very different.
As siblings can be.
Yes, he's also lovely. But, you know, so she like had a resting place here. Charity has some family and friends in the area too. And she's, you know, grew up in Southern Vermont. Not this side of Southern Vermont, but yeah, I think that's a fun little thing, supercharging our, you know, talking to folks who were just like so thrilled to go to the polls and vote for like our own Becca I could see that really like bringing out the primary, especially since our local races very rarely draw anyone to the primaries because they're so, because they're rarely competitive.
Right.
Yeah. The other thing I think, the piece that I wrote that I think has put my finger on the pulse more so than many of the things I write, was about the state of the Vermont Democratic Party, and how from the first of the year until through the primary, they have been on a real winning streak. They've got a new leadership team that seems to be the best they've had in many years. And now with the results of the primary, they have completely replenished their bench, and they have a bunch of people, you know, they have people who are running for the big offices right now, but they also have people in the sort of like the second tier of the ladder who are poised to move up in a few years. You know, somebody like Sarah Copeland Hansis, or Mike Pichak, or Charity candidate for Suddenly, the Democratic Party has some interesting leadership going on, and more resources and a better core staff. So there's a lot going on that's good for the Democratic Party at a time when the Republican Party just gets weaker and weaker and weaker. That's, the Democratic Party has kind of been coasting for the last few years in a lot of ways. And now they seem to be really, focused and energized.
I'm curious, John, in your reporting, have you come across, you mentioned the GOP, have you come across candidates who are running on the Republican ticket who, when you say, like you want to interview them or you invite them to a debate or what have you, and they're just like, my name's on the ballot, and they're not really campaigning in the traditional sense that we think of when we think of campaigning. I've heard this from a number of Republican candidates in this neck of the woods. Are you hearing that as well? And I'm wondering if it's a strategy.
Well, this sort of ties in with something I have observed, which is the stealth candidate, which is the candidate who basically is a QAnon person or a MAGA person, or a very conservative Republican otherwise, who doesn't run on their core issues. They run on sort of vague things about fiscal responsibility and, government transparency and citizen involvement. They don't mention that what they want to do is ban library books and, get critical race theory out of the schools, and all of that stuff. Pardon me.
And I was really, there was an article yesterday, I think, in the Reformer family of newspapers. I think it might have started in the Manchester Journal, that Greg Sukanek did, who's a reporter in that network, about a candidate running in Manchester. And I was so thrilled to see how much he really gave this person all the rope they needed to hang themselves with every, really let the radical ideas flow onto the page in a way that I don't actually often see, because I think a lot of folks in Vermont, a lot of Republicans in Vermont at least, know that if maybe they keep it buttoned up just a little bit long enough to get into office, they'll be safe.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It works on the local level. There have been cases where school board members have been elected who were sort of closet ultra conservatives. Once they get into office and they show their true colors, they wind up losing the next time they run. But they can have at least a short-term effect on a school district, a pretty profound one.
Mm-hmm.
They can cause a lot of trouble. They can make meetings very long and very contentious and very difficult, and in some cases, drive other people off the board, or drive teachers out of school, or drive principals out. So they can do a lot of damage, and they realize that their true ideology won't win in Vermont, so they have to kind of hide behind these platitudes that they put out there. So that's something, I did an occasional series this past spring for the town elections called Dregs of the Ballot, in which I focused the spotlight on some of these people. And I have to start doing that again with candidates for the legislature, because, there really aren't even in Vermont, there really aren't very many what we used to call traditional Republicans left anymore. What's left in the party is, the far right.
Mm-hmm.
Phil Scott is the exception. He's basically washed his hands of the party. And, what's left are the diehards and the true believers and the people who don't, consume any media other than Fox News and, Newsmax and QAnon.
What does it mean to wash your hands of the party and yet still run under its banner and accept its national money, right?
That's a good question.
I have a few colleagues who I work very closely with. I have a lot of respect for, are sort of kingdom adjacent folks who are moderate Republicans. And I wonder regularly, why do you stay with this thing that is such a...
It has quite the reputation now.
Wishful thinking, I suppose. Phil Scott has gotten away with it. He just basically says, I don't have anything to do with them and they don't have anything to do with me. But, he does wear the label, and the few people like him and like Larry Hogan and Charlie Baker, and sort of Susan Collins, provide a little bit of validity to the Republican brand that otherwise would not be there. If Phil Scott was off the ballot, there would be nothing but, the John Clars of the world representing the Republican Party, and then things would get really dire in a hurry for them.
We unfortunately, Emily and John, we're out of time, but any last minute notes you want to leave listeners with before we sign off? Lots to think about, folks. We covered government accountability. We covered housing as a human right. We covered the GOP. So juicy episode. Thank you for that, John. If folks want to read more of your work, where can they find the Vermont Political Observer?
Well, it's very simple. It's the VPO, THEVPO.org, or just, search for Vermont Political Observer and you'll find it. So that's where I hang out.
Fantastic. And Emily, if people want to be in contact with you?
Just want to also give a plug for John's charming Twitter feed. I can be found, or you can find ways to find me, I think is probably more specific, at emilykornheiser.org, where there are links to my phone number and my email address and all my social media feeds, as well as events and opportunities to connect in the real life.
Thank you. And as always, you can find the Montpelier Happy Hour on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station, every Friday at 2 p.m., as well as our Captivate page, our Facebook page. And you can always drop us an email at I'm trying to do the Vermont Political Observer. Sorry. You can drop us an email at the Montpelier Happy Hour at gmail.com. And have a great weekend, everybody.